Today we're going to be talking about how CDATs can better engage with individuals and organisations that represent culturally and linguistically diverse populations. And we're really privileged to have Natasa Zekanovic from Fairfield Council and Nathaly Parish from Fairfield Police here to share their experience and their wisdom on that particular topic. So welcome. Would you like to start by telling us a little bit about yourself, your professional background, and what you do in your particular roles? Maybe perhaps starting with you, Natasa.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis, for having us here today. So, Natasha, I work at Fairfield City Council as a Community Projects and Partnerships Officer, specialising in community safety and crime prevention. So that covers areas like homelessness, domestic violence, drug and alcohol. And I'm also the convener of the co-convener of the Fairfield Community Drug Action Team.
Fabulous, thank you. And
thank
Nathaly.
you, Dennis. So my role with Fairfield Police is a Multicultural Community Liaison Officer. The main focus of my role is to work with communities and be that go between police and communities. So a lot of the work that I do involves trying to build trust between communities and police. Particularly in Fairfield, we have a large population of refugees. So with their past experiences, there's not a lot of trust there between, in police officers or anyone in a uniform. So a lot of our work is trying to build that trust. And then the other part of it is the crime prevention side of things. So that's where I work very closely with Natasa at Fairfield Council. And we run a lot of projects around drugs and alcohol, domestic violence. I do a lot of work with young people as well. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much. And I think it would be really useful to hear a little bit about the multicultural profile of the Fairfield area, because it is one of the most diverse communities in the country, as I understand it.
In Fairfield, between 2016 and 2019, we had approximately 10,000 refugees settled in the Fairfield LGA during that time. A large majority of them were from Syria, so we had a large cohort of Syrian refugees come in, but Fairfield has always been a welcome city from the 50s all the way through. We had the Vietnamese community that arrived and settled in Cabramatta. We've had migration from Europe, so Fairfield is quite diverse, and I think one of the challenges is that we're not just dealing with new arrivals. We've got to also consider our settled communities that have been in Fairfield since the 50s, and that's, our Italian communities, our South American communities, and then we've got our refugee communities that have arrived in the last 5 to 10 years, the new cohorts. So it's about looking at how we tailor our programs to, suit settled communities and make sure they're getting the information they need, and then also how we work with our new arrivals.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I can appreciate that must be a huge challenge, and it's great that we have people like you who are prepared to face that challenge. So looking particularly at the work that CDATs do, which is focusing on trying to reduce the harms associated with drugs and alcohol in those communities, what do you see specifically in terms of the harms experienced by people in your community?
I think we see a lot of stigma around drug and alcohol, so it's very taboo in Cal communities. It's either, this problem doesn't exist in our community, and then that can also be a barrier for seeking support, which is something that we've found has been very challenging, because if we organise, a drug and alcohol event or a workshop, it will be, this issue doesn't exist in our community, so we don't need to go. And it's kind of about breaking down those barriers and saying it's okay to talk about it, and it's okay to have, positive conversations and open conversations around drug and alcohol. So that's definitely been a huge barrier. Other harms that we see is mental health challenges as well, with newly arrived communities, refugee communities. So that's, kind of overlaps with other issues.
I think like the intersectionality of it all. So there's a lot of like Natasha said, mental health is a big one. Our new arrivals and our refugee and asylum seeker communities, there's a lot of PTSD there. So that's one of the factors. Fairfield is also an area that is known for gambling. So gambling is another one of those big risk factors that kind of intersects with drugs and alcohol. We also do a lot of stuff around domestic violence, and we look at how that sort of intersects as well with domestic violence. And I guess one of the things with our CALD communities is the cultural barriers as well. So in some cultures, certain things are normalised, like the shisha in some of our Middle Eastern communities. It's quite a normal, I guess for them, it's quite normal to use. Young people in the family use it, which then normalises vaping and so on. So, yeah.
And I think what we've noticed as well is there's a real disconnect between young people and parents. So you've got this complete different culture at school, and then you come home and there's, the cultural factors, especially in CAL communities. So it's young people kind of living two different worlds and trying to get your parents or your family to understand the challenges you're facing, especially when it's seen as not an issue in the community or it's not talked about. Because the Fairfield CDAT's looking predominantly at young people, and we've definitely found that disconnect. So it's also trying to, I guess, strengthen that, break down the barriers between young people and their family life, which is quite challenging when there's those cultural factors at play as well.
Yes, absolutely, and I've certainly seen that play out in other culturally and linguistically diverse groups in other communities. I guess it's just that much more pronounced in Fairfield because of the depth of the diversity that exists there. But it's great that you've been able to highlight those issues and what you were saying, Nathaly, about intersectionality, because I think that's something that CDATs are now just starting to become much more aware of, that they can't look at a particular problem, say, of abuse of a particular substance in and of itself. There are a whole lot of factors that surround that, and many of the people who are experiencing problems in those areas are also experiencing problems in other areas. So I guess it comes to how what are you doing to address it? How do you overcome those particular barriers there?
I think for us, it's been a lot around consultation. So we do have a Fairfield City drug action plan that we've used to kind of inform our direction for the Fairfield CDAT. We've also got a lot of new members that have joined as well. So we've done a planning day just to understand the different needs. But we find a lot of wide representation on our CDAT. So we've got gambling services, we've got youth support services, mental health, drug and alcohol specific services, just to try and kind of get that holistic overview of what the issues are and looking at that intersectionality as well. And even with our events or programs that we're running, we're trying to move away from just drug and alcohol focus and more of a focus on integrating mental health and looking at other harms more holistically.
Yeah, I think that the language that we use is really important as well. And that's one of the kind of lessons that we've gotten from sort of the DV sector. In Fairfield, maybe 10, 20 years ago, domestic violence was something that just wasn't spoken about. And we did a lot of work there with the communities to start having those conversations, but we never labelled anything as a domestic violence workshop. It was always, healthy relationships and so on. So we're using that sort of similar model now, moving into the drug and alcohol space. We've got an event coming up with young people, and rather than calling it a drug and alcohol awareness day, we're calling it a wellbeing day for youth. So we're very conscious about the language that we use, especially because the majority of our community, English is not their first language. So a lot of the times we find that language doesn't always translate. Some words just don't translate at all, or it translates and it kind of changes the meaning. So we need to be very careful in how we approach things. We try to use a lot of simple English. We use a lot of visuals where possible. When we can, we'll bring interpreters or bilingual workers as well if we're working with communities. So that's one of the things that's always sort of, I guess, in the back of our minds when working with CALD communities.
I was just going to mention on that as well with the wellbeing event, we didn't want to kind of target it just as alcohol and drug focused, just because we may then miss people attending or wanting to come, or potentially parents not wanting to send their kids to an event that's just focused around drug and alcohol. So we're very conscious of the stigma that is surrounding around drugs and alcohol. So just trying to frame our kind of events and programs in a more holistic way, but understanding that, especially post-COVID, all of these factors are kind of intersecting a lot more than what they were. And understanding as well how services have changed, how even working with our schools, there's a lot of things that we've had to consider with this upcoming event that we maybe didn't have to consider before, around just social anxiety around, attending an event as well.
When Natasha was talking about how our CDAT has more of a general representation, we don't actually have community representation on our CDAT. That's something that we've struggled with a little bit. Some of the factors are, though, is that stigma. So because there's so much stigma around drugs and alcohol, to then go and be part of a network that addresses that may not be seen well by the community, or they might see. So there's a lot of, stigma around that. So what we do is, to make sure that we do get that community input, is we do have a lot of consultations, and we work a lot with our community leaders. And that's been a real game changer for us, because if you can access your community leaders, you can then access the rest of your community. So whenever we're looking at new projects and things like that, although we don't have that ongoing community representation on the network, we do go out and make sure that we consult with our communities and make sure that we are, organising projects and developing, projects that are going to be relevant, rather than just us saying, all right, we think this is what you need. So consultation is a big process for us.
Yeah. And in saying that, we've also focused on, equipping community and faith leaders with the resources and the tools to know where do you refer someone in the community, because often what we found is that the first point of contact, so they won't go to a support service, they'll go to their community and faith leader who, they got that trust with, that rapport with. So we did work on a project with the Fairfield local drug action team in developing a resource toolkit, which was co-designed with community and faith leaders. And the main issues they raised were shame, stigma, judgment around drug and alcohol. So we developed some visual cards, really easy to read, just to kind of start breaking down those barriers and knowing, you can actually have positive conversations around alcohol and drugs, and it doesn't have to be, framed so negatively. And the importance of having those conversations and knowing it's okay to seek help, and having those conversations, we've definitely noticed a shift in that language, which has been really, really crucial to the work that we do, and just starting those conversations.
Yeah, that's a really valuable lesson. I'm glad you pointed that out, that notion that sometimes labeling an event as being explicitly about addressing drug or alcohol issues is kind of like waving a red flag, which is going to deter some people from coming because of that, the notion of the stigma around that. But by destigmatizing the event and using very different language and saying this is, we're going to emphasize the more positive aspects of well-being, of health, safety, etc., then people are much more likely to become engaged.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we wouldn't have had that if we didn't consult with the community religious leaders. So we maybe would have had an understanding of what we think are the issues. But when we actually got to speak with community and faith leaders, it was really just kind of came to the forefront that is such a big barrier, and then we're able to kind of work around that. So that kind of research component and that consultation component was so crucial to making sure that we're developing something, like Nat said, that was relevant to the work that we're doing, not just creating a resource or something that wasn't co-designed by the community, which can be challenging because of time and resource constraints. But I think that was really crucial to that project, and being able to develop something that's relevant to the community and addressing the issues that they've raised was really important. Yeah,
fabulous, and I think that's a great takeaway and advice for any CDAT that's working with any sector, a diverse population group, is to not make assumptions about what's going to work for them, but actually to go in and talk to the people who are respected, the leaders within that community, and find out what's really happening and what's going to work and what isn't going to work.
And I think it's also important to consult with various community leaders. So because Fairfield is so diverse, at some of our consultations we had some religious leaders from different religious faiths. We had community leaders from different ethnicities. So we had, in one room, we had, Islamic leaders, Catholics, some of our Buddhist monks. So it was quite a variety. And we find that it's important to consult with everyone because some issues are shared across the board. So we found that there was some things that everyone agreed with. Stigma is one of those things that was raised a lot by a lot of the different communities. But then different community groups also have their own unique challenges. So if you're going to consult, you need to make sure that you're capturing the whole sort of, you're looking at the diversity when you're capturing your consultations, rather than just do a bit of a, consulted with 2 leaders, ticked it off, it's done. It is important to get that wider sort of view.
And in saying that, just to kind of carry that through, so not to just involve them at the beginning stages, to then pilot the resource. Is it working for you? Is anything we need to adjust? And then rolling it out, training and upskilling. So kind of maintaining that trust we've found has worked really well. And then they're more eager to, participate in other projects or learn more about DV or gambling. And then we can kind of continue those relations whilst looking at other issues more holistically as well. Yeah.
Definitely.
And that's another great point. It's about establishing a relationship for the long haul and not creating the impression for that particular cultural group or those leaders that we just want you to give some input to one particular event and then you're never going to see us again. It really is about developing an ongoing relationship with them, something that maintains their engagement, their involvement, and in a way that what you do is relevant, appropriate, and culturally safe for that.
And it also shows them that their input was heard and that something came out of it. Because the last thing we want is to consult, and then nothing comes out of it. And then they say, oh, well, we go to all these consultations and nothing's changed. So we do make a point that once, for example, this project, once it was finalised, we did go back to the original community leaders that we consulted with 2 years ago because it was a COVID project, so it was extended.
So I think that's a really important point that you raise about the importance of being involved with those leaders and with those groups for the long haul, because you don't want to just approach people and say, we need your input on a particular event, and then you never see them again.
That's right.
So.
And I think that one of the things that we focus on is building those relationships with our community and our community leaders during the good times, so that when something does happen and we need their help, we have that access to them. And I think COVID was is a good example of that. Being in Southwest Sydney, we were one of the areas that was hit the hardest, and because we've been working with our community through projects like the CDAT and some of the domestic violence projects and all that, we have those relationships with our community leaders. So when the need arose that we had to reach out to them, those connections were there, and we were able to very quickly access our leaders, work with them, consult with them, and get information out to the communities in language. So that's an example of how valuable those relationships are, but it is important to be consistent.
Yeah. And I think we're very lucky with Fairfield CDAT Council and Police. We have a very good working relationship. So I didn't have contacts with community and faith leaders, but Nathaly and her team did. So that worked really well to then be able to tap into those resources, but work with organisations who've already got those relationships. So instead of me approaching community and faith leaders, I was able to go through the multicultural community liaison officers at Fairfield Police who have that trust already. So I think that's a huge thing to kind of map out what kind of relationships there are and what different, resources organisations have. So you're not kind of starting from scratch, but you're also doing it in a way that's culturally sensitive when you're inviting leaders to an event, and then you build those relations and that trust. But doing that service mapping within your CDAT, or seeing what are the gaps and who can you invite or who can you include in the CDAT to who have those kind of resources and capacity and relations as well is very important.
Yeah, fabulous. No, that's great advice to see what's really happening in the area, rather than make assumptions about sending somebody in to talk to a person that may not be the appropriate way to go.
Yeah, and we find that you're never going to be able to know everybody and every leader, but if you know some of the key people, having Fairfield Council be part of the CDAT as a co-convener also makes a big difference. I think having council's involvement and council support definitely helps with the work that we do. They offer a lot of support in terms of, even just providing a room for us to hold our meetings, things like that. So it definitely helps having council on board, and then it's mapping the area and saying, okay, if we need to access our refugee community, who are the services working with them? Okay, we can go to STUDS. If we need to access our young people, who do we go to? We can go to the Youth Workers Network. So once you know who's in your area and who's working with who, it does make it a lot easier to then be able to access those different communities.
Yeah. And it also leads to cooperation and collaboration on events as well, so that the workload is spread among a whole lot of people.
Yeah, and we've seen a kind of a change in the membership of the CDAT. So we kind of did a wide expression of interest and just sent it to all of our different networks, because what we're hearing is it's crossing over in our homelessness interagencies and our domestic violence interagencies. So just inviting all organisations. We definitely have more of a wide range of services now on the CDAT, which has informed a lot of our understanding, and a lot came out of our planning day as well around how the issue kind of intersects, and what we can do to kind of make sure our projects are more holistic as well.
Yeah.
We also try to have, there's a lot of communication between networks. So there's a community drug action team. We've also got the local drug action team, which has similar members. But then Fairfield's got, the Fairfield Domestic Violence Committee, the Youth Workers Network. We've got the Fairfield Migrant Interagencies. So we try to get representatives that attend different networks. So then when we do have info share, we've got people at the CDAT that say, okay, well, at the domestic violence meeting, we spoke about this, and maybe this is where it crosses over. We've got Sean, who attends the CDAT, and he co-convenes the Youth Workers Network, so we get that point of view. So although we don't have everyone around the table, we've got representatives from different networks where we can then be able to see where projects may cross over, how we can collaborate, share funding, resources, all that kind of stuff.
I think the info share component is such an amazing part of the CDAT as well, because then you're sharing contacts, you're learning about different services, and we try and include guest speakers from different services just to present a bit about what the organisation does. But we've definitely found the info share part of it just kind of complements everything that this CDAT does, because we're able to strengthen partnerships and learn about services we weren't aware of, and that just continues to grow even post-COVID. So that's been really great as well. Yeah.
And just to add to that, the other importance of working collaboratively is what we're finding, particularly in Fairfield, is that our community leaders are being pulled in all different directions. So everyone's caught on to, if you want to work with co-communities, you've got to work with community leaders. So they get approached from individual organisations, individual networks constantly, and they also have their own jobs and things that they do. So what we find is that by working collaboratively, we can come up with an approach where we can work with our community leaders without overwhelming them. So rather than have 3 organisations approach them about drugs and alcohol, we approach them as a network, and we can then work with the other organisations, and then we can find a way that we can work with our community leaders in a much more efficient way. And that way we can also make sure that they're getting something out of it. So they're getting, there's the capacity building component, the networking, but we're not overwhelming them, because otherwise they do get approached constantly to attend this consultation and that consultation and so on. So it is important to be aware of that when you are working with community leaders, that they may be, I guess, overwhelmed by the amount of people reaching out to them. So if you can find a way to do it more efficiently, they appreciate that.
Yeah, that's absolutely fabulous. And really the work that you're doing is great, particularly from the perspective of the extent to which you really understand and come to grips with the problems in your area, the challenges that you face in addressing them, and most importantly, you've come up with some really good principles that you follow in terms of how to address those problems through engagement, collaboration, and cooperation. So there's a lot of great takeaways from this discussion that I'm sure are going to be valuable to any CDAT that's working with very similar kinds of challenges. So thank you very much for your time. It's been really enlightening and illuminating. I've certainly learned a lot, and I really appreciate you coming in and talking to us about that.
Thank you, Dennis.